The following talk was given at the Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California. Please visit our website at audiodharma.org.
So I wanted to continue the conversation about getting familiar with delusion, recognizing it, understanding it, seeing how it works. I've been talking about this for a number of weeks. There's so much to say about it. And I've talked about, I have this kind of sense of different levels or layers of delusion, and just give a little overview here before I kind of dive into this week's aspect to explore. The different levels of delusion, the most obvious level, the one that we're probably most familiar with, and maybe a little lower on the volume, Richard, yeah. The one we're most familiar with, perhaps, is, that's good, thanks, is the disconnection from experience, when we're spaced out, when we're basically not aware. That's a kind of a form of delusion, when we are not aware of what's happening in the present moment, but instead are caught by our thoughts, our views, our beliefs, and so we're kind of in a story or in a dream, unaware of what's happening around us. And something I want to say too, I just actually decided this morning to look up in the dictionary the definition of delusion and to look up in Wikipedia what they have to say about delusion. And largely in our language, delusion is used to refer to a mental illness. And so I want to say that, well, to some extent the Buddha is talking about, in this aspect of delusion, is talking about ways in which we're all not right in our minds. Yet the kind of delusion I'm also talking about here isn't what we would typically call mental illness. If we do think about mental illness as being not having an accurate perception of reality, then indeed this is what the Buddha is talking about. And yet, I think in the psychological sense, it's the frame of delusion is having a different representation of reality than most people around us, and so a kind of a representation of reality that's based on confused perception of the world. And in fact, that is what the Buddha points to around delusion, and yet it's not about what we typically think of as mental illness. So I just want to kind of reframe the word a little bit, because sometimes when people, maybe, since I realize that word is typically used to refer to mental illness in English, then there may be a little bit of a separation. Well, I'm not deluded, and we all have delusion in the way the Buddha speaks about it. And so this is one aspect, the aspect of basically not knowing what's happening in the present moment and being caught in our thoughts, lost in a world of thought. And this happens all the time to us. So that's kind of the most basic form of delusion. A second form of delusion is a kind of delusion that's based on conditioning from our families, from our cultures, from how we were raised, from our social groups, ideas, views, opinions that we don't see as ideas, views, opinions. So, and sometimes we don't, like if we're raised with a certain perspective. For instance, some families might be raised with the perspective, just a simple example, that everybody stays at the table until you're done eating, until everybody is done eating. That may be the culture of a family. And then and so you just assume that's the way it is. And then if you go to somebody else's house for dinner and you see people kind of leaving at various times, it might feel really odd to you. And it begins to point out, oh, that isn't the way it is, it's a perspective. And so as a simple example, that's the kind of thing, a view, a perspective based on our upbringing, our conditioning in the world. And the biggest aspect of it is, as delusion, isn't so much that we're that it's a problem that we have this perspective that families stay together while they're having a meal. It's not particularly a problem. Where the delusion comes in, and what happens more often than you would think is when those views become entrenched to a sense of rightness. It's like this is the right way to live, and that's the wrong way to live, or my way of doing this is the right way. So that's where the delusion begins to creep in to views, is that we don't see it as a perspective, we see it as a truth. And so that's the kind of second level of delusion, a level of delusion that's kind of, we all get shaped with various perspectives in our lives, and when we don't see them as perspectives, that's the second form of delusion. And we all have, cultures have their perspectives, and families have their perspectives, and we grow up with perspectives based on, individual perspectives based on all kinds of things, like how we were treated as a child, or how kids related to us on the playground, or how things happened to us in college. I mean, all kinds of ways that we're shaped personally, individually, and views form around that. In that form of delusion, and in the next form, the one that a piece of which I'd like to focus on today, in that form of delusion, it's not so much about that we're not knowing what's happening in the present moment. So it's not like that disconnection from experience. We're aware in the present moment, but it's like we've got a filter on of what's right and what's true, and anything that doesn't correspond to that becomes uncomfortable or confusing or wrong. And so that it's not that we're not seeing what's happening in the world, but we're not seeing it, let's say we're seeing it through a filter. And so we're not necessarily seeing it accurately. So this is the second form of delusion. The third form of delusion I would call more human delusion. Delusions that we all share as human beings, regardless of how we're shaped by our cultures. In some ways, I think there's three forms of this, or three major forms of this the Buddha points to, that we tend to take what is impermanent to be permanent. We tend to take what is unreliable to be a reliable source of happiness. And we tend to take what is not self to be self. And in some ways I see these human delusions they are also conditioned, by the way. They are also conditioned by our interaction with the world. But I see them as being more conditioned by our human apparatus, our organism, by the way our human organism functions in relationship to the world. So for instance, taking what is impermanent to be permanent, there's a lot about our human apparatus that tries to stabilize the world so that we can navigate it. And so that functioning of our sight and sound and smell and taste and touch, I mean, just the way our senses work together. Like for instance, I look at that wall over there, and I see it's a wall, and if I were to be told to run headlong that way, my body would come up short before it hit the wall, because I also know about the hardness of that wall. I've touched against walls a lot in my life, and so there's something in my mind that understands hardness of the wall as a physical experience. But the sight experience and the physical experience are different sense impressions, and yet the mind weaves them together to create a sense of stability. It's like it's very hard for my mind to separate the sight from the understanding that it's hard. And so that's why if I were to run headlong towards it, my mind would, my system would pull me up short so that I wouldn't damage the body if I hit the wall quickly. And so our system is designed to stabilize and to integrate experience. And that's one of the reasons why we tend to take what's impermanent to be permanent. Because our mind tends to stabilize experience. And I talked about this piece of it last week, and so I don't want to go into that too much more. If you're interested in hearing more about that, you could listen to the Audio Dharma podcast on that piece of it. Today I'd like to focus a little bit more on the aspect of taking what is unreliable to be reliable. Taking what's unreliable as a lasting source of happiness, to be a reliable, lasting source of happiness. This characteristic, we could call it a characteristic of unreliability. Actually, the Buddhist teachings speak about these three areas: impermanent, unreliable, not self, as being kind of foundational characteristics of all experience. And so when we are not understanding experience to be impermanent, unreliable, not self, we're essentially not aligning ourselves with kind of how experience actually works, or the truth of how experience actually functions. And so that's where some of the suffering starts to happen. And so the truth of unreliability, or the characteristic, let's call it characteristic, that's the language that the commentaries use, a characteristic of unreliability, is understood to be kind of a foundational experiential reality for human beings. That there is nothing that we can experience, nothing that in our experience is a place or a reliable enough experience that we can find it, land on it, and find a lasting happiness with it. The underlying reason for that unreliability is related to the characteristic of impermanence. Everything that we experience, at large levels, at small levels, has this characteristic of impermanence, this characteristic that it changes. And, again, our human system is designed to kind of stabilize, and also there's different scales of change. So, the scale of the change of the planet Earth, for instance, it's been created over billions of years, but human beings were not always on the planet, and human beings won't always be on the planet. At some point, the planet will be burned up with the sun as it implodes and expands and becomes a red giant, and so at some point, even the Earth will disappear. And yet, the scale of that change is so vast that we can't perceive it so much. And then there's change on the very microscopic level. I mean, particle physics tells us that this table is mostly space. And yet, the particles are moving so rapidly that it creates this experience of solidity as it hits our system. And yet my understanding also is that in terms of the atoms on my hands, the experience is not one of solidity, but one of exchange. And so some of the molecules and atoms on my hands are, kind of interweaving with the atoms and molecules of the table here as I contact it. So, the differences of scale and perspective. Last week I talked about reflecting about impermanence as being a really helpful tool to begin to break or to undermine our habitual imputation of permanence to experience. But at every level of experience, impermanence is a truth. And because of that, when we try to find happiness by hanging on to something, by controlling or finding a way to have something, if what we think of as happiness is getting what I want, getting rid of what I don't want, and that's largely how we think of happiness before we really begin to explore and investigate what that kind of happiness is. If that's how we think of happiness, then we are doomed to the truth of impermanence and unreliability, the truths of impermanence and unreliability. Because if we try to hang on to something and say, okay, that relationship, that house, that car is where I will find my happiness. The security of having this thing is where I will find my happiness. If we tie our happiness to having things, then the truth of impermanence will eventually come around, and that experience, that thing will disintegrate. Often what happens more often is that there's a kind of a way that our system, our habit of finding happiness works. And a lot of that is around this, it's like we want something pleasant maybe, we want to find it, we want to get it. And when we get something pleasant, there's a moment of, right before, there's a kind of a moment of, I'm about to get this thing, I'm about to have it. So the moment of anticipation is often a very pleasant moment. It's connected with the sense of something pleasant is going to come to me, and it's also connected to the sense of I'm in control, I've figured it out. I'm going to have this thing. I know how to get these things. And so there's an aspect of it that's related to control. That moment of anticipation is the happiness of that. And then there's the happiness that comes when we get that thing or get rid of it. The same process functions around getting rid of something unpleasant. And so this cycle that we have, that's largely the way that we have found happiness. That's largely the way that, again, because of the way our organism works, in some ways I see our organism as being oriented towards trying to find happiness or well-being. And in our life, largely the way we have found some measure of happiness is through getting what we want, through getting rid of what we don't want. And so over and over again in our lives, we have learned getting what I want. That's what makes me feel good. Getting rid of what I don't want. Then I can feel like I'm in control and I don't have to be with things I don't like. That makes me feel good. And so over and over again, we've had that reinforced through our human experience. This is a human issue. It's not a cultural thing. It's really a human issue. And so our human system, partly because that's the way our organism works, that we orient towards not having distress in the body, and so things like hunger, we get food, it feels good, we have that moment of feeling like, okay, I'm feeling comfortable now, or pain in the body, we figure out how to not have pain in the body. So those kind of very natural human experiences kind of reinforce that belief that that's how happiness is found. And so we have this kind of conditioned belief. We have experienced that over and over in our lives from the time we are very young. From the moment we come out of the womb, we are being conditioned in this way through our human body. And so we have that as one of the sources for this belief that this is how happiness comes to be. And so, the Buddha, in talking about this, in pointing to this, acknowledges that yes, there is a form of happiness that comes from getting what we want. There's a form of happiness that comes from that. And yet, because of the truth of impermanence, that happiness won't last very long. And so we're back on the wheel of, as soon as we find that that either the thing is no longer around or the pleasure of the having has faded. That's a big part of why the happiness of having is not so reliable. Because the nature of that kind of having, while you may, for instance, you may get something, something that you really enjoy, some new toy, and great, it gives you some happiness, and then after a while, the kind of that happiness of having becomes less satisfying. So maybe you still have the toy, maybe the toy hasn't gotten stolen or lost or broken. But somehow the pleasure of the having isn't as good as that moment of the feeling of anticipation, of about to get something, of the being in control. And so we're looking for that feeling again. And so even though, not everything vanishes and disappears, the way our minds work around that kind of happiness is that it's not, that kind of happiness doesn't actually last that long. And that's one of the things the Buddha encouraged us to look at around that kind of happiness and this kind of belief that having what I want will bring me happiness. This is kind of the underlying delusion around the truth of unreliability, the characteristic of reliability, is that the having will bring me lasting happiness. And so if we can begin to check out, well, how long does that happiness actually last? Sometimes it can last a while. I think when I first got my iPad a couple years ago, the happiness of that lasted a few weeks. And then, it started just being more like a tool, and the fact of the organizational capability that it gave me, that I could carry my calendar around with me easily, those kind of delights that I had around the iPad began to wane. I mean, it just became more the way it was instead of being a source of happiness. So, so this belief that the having of things will make us happy begins to be undermined as we look at how long does the happiness of having actually last. Another thing that we can, first I'll also point to, so this thing about this way of being in the world, and that essentially this mechanism of getting what we want, bringing us happiness, that's largely the way that we have found even little moments of happiness in our lives. When we've managed to control something, when we've managed to be able to spend time with something that makes us feel good. So the having or the getting rid of, that has been largely the way that we have found happiness through our lives. And that because of that, it's like our mind is believing that is as good as it gets. That is the best way to happiness. It's like we can't fathom that there might be another way. And this is one of the things I think that the Buddha was so brilliant about, because he asked the question. He said, wow, I see that this pattern of trying to get what I want, and people running around trying to control and manipulate and have things, I just see the suffering it creates in the world. Is there another way? Is there another way towards happiness? So that was his question. That was his search. And so he asked the question, might there be another way to happiness? Most of us don't even think to ask that question. Or if we do think to ask that question, we don't necessarily come into contact with somebody who is teaching a response to that question other than, more of getting what you want. I mean, what we're surrounded by in our culture, the advertisements, what other people tell us is, getting that job, having that relationship, having that thing, having that status, having people think about you the way you want them to think about you. That's where happiness comes. And so not only is this delusion that having what I want will make me happy, that having what I want will bring a long-term lasting happiness, not only is it reinforced by our human apparatus, our human functioning, but it's also reinforced by our friends, our families, our cultures, because that's what they know too. And so, that's kind of the direction. Yes, get what you want, and some of the wiser people help us understand that the impermanence of it isn't necessarily, that we have to accept that with grace. That's part of our lives as human beings, of understanding the impermanent nature of that kind of happiness and to accept it with grace, and that we have these rhythms of happiness and sadness. And the Buddha wanted to understand if there was a more reliable kind of happiness. And his exploration, his own work revealed to him that yes, there is a more reliable kind of happiness. And that comes through a whole different approach to meeting experience. Rather than through this notion of I have to get what I want to be happy, it's more about coming into alignment with the truth of impermanence, coming into alignment with the truth of unreliability, and letting go. Letting go of, a lot of it is around letting go of the belief that I should be able to make myself happy in this way. The underlying delusion associated with unreliability is that I should be able to make myself happy in this way. It's like either we feel that, this delusion that happiness should be findable. I mean, maybe some of us don't recognize that these moments of happiness come and go, but still we think that the best it could get would be to find a way to, it's like stringing beads. It's like if we could string enough happiness beads on this string so that they're connected, so that as soon as that one ends, I've got another one ready to go. And then the next one and the next one, that some of us think that, well, that might be as good as it gets. But again, that puts us on this kind of like endless, exhausting wheel to find the next happiness. And the Buddha points to this as being a wheel of suffering. And it's this the pattern that I described of wanting to have something, something pleasant, or wanting to get rid of something unpleasant. So there's that movement. It's a very, very human movement to move towards the pleasant, away from the unpleasant. Again, kind of our human apparatus is designed that way. So to move towards the pleasant and want it, to want to have it, to like it, to try to get it, to control it. And that whole pattern there, there's ways in which the way our system works, essentially, around wanting to be in association with pleasant and not in association with unpleasant, that pattern of wanting and getting and having reinforces itself in this way. So when there's something that we want, so something pleasant out there, something that we want, as soon as we want it, as soon as we feel like we want to have that thing, as soon as there's a feeling of desire for it, a craving for it, that very desire, that very craving creates a sense of offness. It creates a sense of lack. It's not that it's that the lack is the feeling of offness is that wanting itself. The wanting creates a kind of a feeling of something's wrong here. Now that feeling of offness that comes with wanting is subtle. Sometimes. Often I would say it's subtle. Sometimes it's, if there's frustration, if we're not able to get that thing, the wanting of that becomes clear. The unpleasantness of that wanting becomes clear. Frustrated desire is clearly unpleasant. But if we're in the direction of feeling like we're going to get that thing, then the unpleasantness of the wanting is masked. It's obscured, usually by some thought, some idea of how great it's going to be when I get that thing. Again, this is kind of subtle. It's below the level of our conscious awareness often that this is happening. And so as soon as there is wanting, there is a little bit of unpleasantness there, a little bit of agitation in the mind. That agitation is obscured perhaps by the pleasantness of the fantasy of the having, and then we kind of orient our actions towards the getting. And if we succeed, there's the pleasure that happens that comes from the feeling like we're in control. We can do this. There's the pleasure of the moment before, the anticipation of the having. That kind of moment of delight. I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, or maybe even last week, the Winnie the Pooh story of somebody asking Winnie the Pooh what his favorite thing in the world was. And he thought for a moment and he said, well, while eating honey is a very good thing, there's a moment right before which is even better, but I don't know what it's called. And that moment of just before, that moment of anticipation, to me it's like the congealing, it's the, yes, I figured it out, I'm gonna get this. Like that, there's the feeling of control, of I've got it figured out, is huge in that moment. And that feels really good. We really like that feeling of being in control. It's even better, according to our system, than having that pleasant thing. And so there's that moment of, in the moment when we, the moment before, we have that moment of feeling like we're in control, and the moment of the having of the thing, Actually, I think in the anticipation and in the having, the wanting is in the process of going away. So as in the moment of anticipation, probably what's starting to happen there too is that the wanting is, because there's the understanding of, I am going to have this thing, it's like the wanting is releasing at that point. And then the wanting has released when we have the having. And so the unpleasantness, the agitation of the wanting goes away when we get the thing. And so not only do we get the pleasantness of the having and the pleasantness of the anticipation, the feeling like we're in control, but we get the pleasantness of the unpleasant wanting going away. And that unpleasant, that agitation, the subtle feeling of, oh, is this going to work? Am I going to get this? Is this going to be okay? Am I going to be okay? That like underlying anxiety that is coming with that wanting is a huge driver for our system. And I will propose to you, and you can begin to explore this yourselves, that actually in our experience of the anticipation and in the having, that the biggest part of why we like that moment is because the anxiety and the wanting go away for a moment. That's another huge source of the gratification of getting what we want, that the wanting goes away. The wanting believes that it's necessary to have in order for that happiness of the wanting to go away to happen. So embedded in the wanting is this belief that when I want something, that the way to be okay around that wanting is to get the thing. So wanting has this delusion. The wanting itself is kind of a pull towards something pleasant. It's that kind of wish that we have to move in the direction of pleasant and away from unpleasant. It kind of got a feeling of almost like magnetism, that wanting. It's a pull towards. Embedded in that wanting is a delusion that having that thing, or that accomplishing the action of that pull to get that thing, is what will make me happy. Wanting is not going to tell you that the wanting going away, whether or not you get the thing, the wanting going away will bring a very deep kind of happiness. The release of the wanting. And this is what the Buddha discovered. That the release of the wanting, or the non-arising of the wanting, that we don't have that kind of sense or the underlying delusion that is what will make me happy. So the release of that wanting is where a different kind of happiness can be found. And so we can begin to explore this in our meditation, in our practice. Begin to look at what happens for us as we maybe just play with small wantings. See what happens as we explore watching the mind be drawn to something and choose from time to time, rather than acting on that wanting, to see what happens if we don't act on that wanting. What happens? Because the wanting too is an impermanent phenomenon. It will not last forever. And so if we have enough patience, we can notice at some point that the wanting goes away. often when we begin this exploration, it's more like we lose interest in the watching of this whole process, and sometime later we realize, oh, I don't want that thing anymore. We haven't actually seen the wanting go away. It's more like the mind has gotten tired of fighting the urge, and it's just kind of gone on to something else or something like that. But we may begin to notice in that, yeah, I never ended up getting that latte or whatever it was, but and the wanting for it is gone now. So yeah, it's not a problem now. So we might begin to understand or recognize that that the wanting doesn't have to be satisfied. And this is something that we do learn as children, delayed gratification. We learn this kind of thing as children, that we don't have to satisfy every single urge. But what we can also start to see with mindfulness practice and real curiosity about the factor of wanting in the mind is to begin to get really familiar with the feeling of the wanting itself, the pull, the feeling of being off balance, the feeling of agitation, of anxiety, of discomfort around the wanting itself. And so this takes a kind of a diving below the thoughts, right? I said that often that discomfort of wanting is obscured by our ideas. And it takes some courage too, to be curious and willing to hang out with the discomfort of wanting and not following through on that wanting. And so we begin to actually see and recognize, oh, wanting is unpleasant. Wanting has an uncomfortable feeling. And at some point we might also start to see, from time to time, I have seen this in daily life. I've also seen it on retreat, but in daily life I've seen that one time, sitting by an intersection and seeing a Starbucks across the street, the mind created the image of a latte and really, created the wanting for the latte. And I decided in that moment, okay, I was sitting at a red light, so I got to watch it for a little while. Starbucks was in my view. The idea of the latte was in my view. But I decided that I would just watch the wanting and that I would not, as I turned the corner when the light turned green, pull into the Starbucks and get the latte, that I would just keep going by. And after I had gotten past the point where it would have been more effort, essentially, to make a U-turn, waited another couple lights to get back to the Starbucks, at some point I realized there was a point at which the wanting just crumbled. As we see wanting let go, we begin to feel this different kind of ease and happiness. When I've seen wanting vanish, it feels like the mind is released from a vice grip. It's like the wanting is this slave driver. It says, you will get this thing. And being released from that energy is like being freed from that slave driver, released from a vice grip. And this is what the Buddha began to recognize, that the energy of the craving, the energy of the wanting, is the very thing that is creating all of this suffering. And so exploring that, beginning to be curious about that. What is the wanting? And another thing that he encouraged us to do around exploring this delusion is also, again, as I said, to recognize how long does the happiness of the having actually last? So there is some gratification to having something that we want, but how long does it actually last? And then recognizing that it's not a mistake. It's not either our fault or some fatal flaw in the universe when that kind of happiness fades. It's the nature of it. It's an unreliable kind of happiness. Yes, it is a kind of happiness, and it's very unreliable. And so beginning to investigate that, the extent, how long does it actually last? We tend to, because of this delusion that we should be able to get what we want, and that happiness should be reliable in this way. Somehow the belief of that creates either a feeling, often can create either the feeling that somehow I have failed when some kind of happiness doesn't last, or I'm not able to string together like beads on a string, happiness after happiness. Somehow I'm at fault. Or we feel somehow that the universe is at fault. You know, that it's just a fundamental flaw of the universe. Well, it is a fundamental reality of the universe. And fighting that fundamental reality of the universe is where so much of the rub of suffering happens. There's a great cartoon, I'll share it with you. This is a Pearls Before Swine comic. And it's, it's got the animals who have these little communities, and the mouse is sitting at a desk writing a letter. And the letter goes, "Dear life, I'm writing you to express my dissatisfaction. First, I didn't ask to be put here. You put me here. That started us off on a bad foot. Given that rocky start, I'd think you'd strive to be a good host. But no, you fill this place with unpleasant surprises. And if that's not enough, at some point, I apparently cease to exist in a manner that is most likely shocking, painful, and tragic. Can I say rip-off? Please provide a refund." And then Pig comes up, and Mouse turns to Pig and says, "Where do I send one of these?" So this idea that somehow it's a flaw, that this is the way life is. It is the way life is. And when we fight it, like Mouse is fighting it, when we fight it, that's where the suffering of, the optional kind of suffering comes in, essentially. We fight unreliability, we fight impermanence, and we suffer. So one thing I want to say, essentially what the Buddha suggested, he suggested these pieces around watching the wanting and noticing how far does gratification extend. He also said, he used this language around these truths. The use of the word characteristic, I used that word before, often in this tradition, we talk about the characteristics of impermanence, unreliability, not self. And that language of characteristic, of these being characteristics of experience or characteristic of what's happening, that's language that came later. It wasn't language the Buddha used. The Buddha encouraged us to cultivate the perception of impermanence, to cultivate the perception of unreliability, really in a very... I think really what the Buddha was pointing to is that all we can know are perceptions anyway. We can't really know what's actually a characteristic of reality. And so he encouraged us to look at what are our perceptions and what perceptions align us with the direction of a deeper kind of happiness, and what perceptions catch us up in suffering. And in particular, he said, cultivate the perception of impermanence and cultivate the perception of unreliability. And so to do this, we essentially, all we need to do is watch our experience and begin to recognize that things are impermanent, that things are unreliable as a source of lasting happiness. Part of the difficulty with the way our minds work is that we have kind of a proclivity to either see things that correspond with our biases or not see things. Well, and we see things that correspond with our biases, and we don't see things that don't correspond with our biases. And this is true for these kind of perceptions as well, for these kind of aspects of experience. That impermanence is staring us in the face. It doesn't actually take much to recognize it. The corollary of unreliability is staring us in the face. When we begin to be curious, or essentially, as the Buddha says, cultivate the perception, it's more like attuning to that things are unreliable in your life, that things are impermanent in your life. It begins to kind of poke holes in those delusions, those kind of biases that we have, that things are permanent, that things are reliable. So cultivating these perceptions. And it's not about creating impermanence where it doesn't exist. It's more about recognizing what's already there to be seen in our experience. Not brushing by it. And as we kind of come into alignment with those perceptions, as we come into alignment with those, and recognize that that is the way experience is, we begin. It's actually it's not depressing. We might think it would be depressing to really take in impermanence. We might think it would be depressing to really acknowledge that we cannot find happiness in the way that we've thought in the past. And yet what happens, what I see happening more and more is that as we orient or align to this kind of understanding, that because we've stopped fighting the truth, we, instead of acting out of delusion and confusion, we begin to act out of wisdom that understands that this is the nature of experience. This is the nature of human life. That things change, that there's nothing reliable in experience that I can hold on to forever as happiness. And so our actions, sometimes when we explore this notion of craving and wanting being a source of suffering, there's the question that comes up, well, why would I do anything if I didn't want to do it? And again, that's a kind of a delusion that is embedded in the wanting. Wanting cannot fathom any other kind of way to action than through craving, or that kind of craving. We can call, there's a kind of an agency in our system, a sense of motivation, of activity. Our systems are active systems. And yet that activity doesn't have to be motivated by greed or by aversion or by delusion. It can be motivated by wisdom, by compassion, by kindness, by generosity, by different qualities than greed, aversion, and delusion. And so, the belief that, well, if I let go of all craving, then I would never do anything. That's a delusion also. Because as wisdom begins to grow stronger, as we begin to understand and align ourselves with truth, that wisdom wants to act. It wants to act to alleviate suffering in the world. It wants to act to support moving towards a deeper kind of well-being. And so I always like to point to the kind of misunderstanding that can happen around these teachings, that we think that, well, what being awake means is not doing anything, and it does not mean that. It means instead that we are acting in alignment with truth rather than acting in denial of truth. And I talked the whole time, so I'll try to leave more time for comments the next time. I'll be away for a couple of weeks, and so I'll continue talking about human delusion when I return. And as always, there'll be somebody here the next couple of weeks. Thank you.